Do we need a new paradigm for thinking about criminal justice? Welcome to the Convocations program at Carleton College. I'm your host, Carrie Rott, Director of Events. Now we'll be together for 1 hour and we'll include time for questions. You may click on that Q&A tab on your screen to submit your questions at any time, and I will pose them to our guest speaker at the conclusion of her presentation. Dr. Baz Dreisinger is a professor, author, and journalist working at the intersection of race, crime, culture, and justice. Her acclaimed book, Incarceration Nation, is a first-person odyssey through the prison systems of the world, illuminating the human stories of incarcerated men and women and those who imprison them. She is the founder of the Prison to College Pipeline program at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice in New York City. The program offers college courses and reentry planning to incarcerated men at Otisville Correction Facility, and broadly works to increase access to higher education for incarcerated and formerly incarcerated individuals. A 2017-18 Global Fulbright Scholar, Dr. Dreisinger is seeking to internationally replicate the Prison to College pipeline with a focus on the Caribbean and South Africa. She's currently working on a roadmap for how prison to college pipelines and restorative justice can replace mass incarceration as a system of justice. The title of her presentation is Incarceration Nation, a Journey to Justice in Prisons Around the World. Welcome to Carleton College, Dr. Dreisinger.
It's great to virtually be here. Thank you so much for having me. I wish I was with you in person as I was meant to be, but we will have an excellent virtual time together talking about some of these critical issues. So I will share my screen and we can get going because we've got a lot to talk about today. So today we're going to take a virtual journey around the world, something we haven't done. We haven't crossed borders, many of us, in quite some time, in order to rethink justice and rethink prisons. When I first started volunteering and working in prisons about, well, must be almost 20 years ago now, I heard a lot of, are you crazies? And people would look at me funny and say, why are you educating those prisoners? And I was actually working as a volunteer at the time. I was an educational volunteer in prisons. I had been invited by some groups inside the prisons who had read my work and were interested in having me. And I became very passionate about that work and ultimately founded the Prison to College Pipeline program, which is in its 11th year. It's a university program inside prison that also works to reintegrate folks when they come home from prison and guarantee them a place in prison when they get out. And I started this program and you know, it pretty much consumed my life. And we can talk some more about it in the Q&A. But ultimately, what I started to notice in the last maybe 5-6 years or so, 6-7 years, is that as I would tell people that I worked in prison, that I taught in prison, they looked at me a little bit less crazy. And people started to understand. And that is because what started to happen really in the US within the last 6 or 7 years or so is that folks began to recognize that this issue of mass incarceration is the civil rights issue of our time. And I can throw a lot of statistics at you. I won't, they're very easy to find, but suffice it to say that with 2.3 million people behind bars in the US, we are the world's largest incarcerator. We have 25% of the world's prison population with only 5% of the population. It is considered an estimated $50 billion industry. The racial disparities and inequities in our system are quite dramatic and horrific. To share one statistic that in many ways sums it up, the US has more African Americans under criminal supervision today than it did slaves in the height of slavery in 1850. And thanks to books like The New Jim Crow and films like 13th, if you haven't seen that or read it, you should. This issue started to become front and center stage quite a bit more. And I can definitely say that in the last year, even more so, thanks to the uprisings of last summer and the tragic deaths and murders that keep on happening in the hands of police. But what I started to notice is a few things. One is that while there was lots of attention in the US to this issue, that did not exist globally. And as you can see by the globe behind me, I love the globe. I love the world. I travel quite a bit. I'm very passionate about traveling and combining my work and my social justice work with my travel. And I began to notice there wasn't a lot of attention to this issue globally. Nor was there attention to the fact of, and this I learned as I began to research, the fact of the ways that the US has played a role in imposing incarceration on the world. And the other thing I began to notice is that a lot of the arguments, and I think this persists to this day, a lot of the arguments against mass incarceration would be heavily economic in nature. It's too expensive, it's cheaper to do it another way. And what worried me about that line of thinking is that if it's only about dollars and cents, then we can find a cheaper way to warehouse human beings and increase social inequity. And so it felt to me like I wanted to do a fundamental sort of turning on the head of this issue of prison. Why do we even lock people up at all? Where did this come from? What's the history of it? What's the philosophy behind it? And I wanted to do this in a global context because often when you look at something outside of the context that you're at home in, you can see it much more clearly. And so that's how Incarceration Nations, my book, and ultimately, as I'll talk about at the end of this presentation, Incarceration Nations Network was born. And I determined that I would travel to prisons around the world, ultimately 9 countries, and I would kind of theme the book on certain issues that cut across national borders, where I would explore fundamental issues in prison via visits to these 9 countries. And so what I'm going to do today is just quickly, in a whirlwind fashion, run us through some of these countries and some of the issues that I learned in the context of those journeys to those places. And I'm going to frame this in what I like to call the myth busting approach. And I do that because I think there are many things that we take for granted in the world, sadly, and we don't question. And prison is certainly one of them. I find that when it comes to criminal justice issues, and I always found this in years of teaching inside the classroom where students just kind of took for granted that prisons always were and always shall be, and, do the crime, do the time. There were all these kind of axiomatic things that people were taking for granted. And that's exactly what I wanted to unseat. And that's what I want to do today with all of you, is unseat some assumptions. And I don't come here with all the answers, but I do come with a lot of questions and a lot of encouragement to keep asking those questions and not take things for granted, particularly in this critical space of justice, which is really at the centerpiece of how we live our lives. So I started the book, and I start today and my journey in Rwanda. And this is a picture of Kigali prison in Rwanda. And the reason I started the journey in Rwanda is because probably even when I say the word Rwanda, the first thing that comes to mind for almost all of you is genocide, is the terrible crime that happened in 1994, a national stain, national horror, in which genocide occurred between the Hutus and the Tutsis, and almost 1 million people being killed in 90 days. And I wanted to go to Rwanda to look at genocide and engage with survivors of genocide, because I always come to justice work from a restorative justice perspective. And what that means is that I center survivors at the heart of the criminal justice system and thinking about justice. Instead of asking, who did it and how do we punish them, when harm occurs, when a crime occurs, the first question we should ask, and this is kind of the fundamental premise of restorative justice, is who was harmed and how do we address their harms? And what I came to find in Rwanda, and I ultimately ended up spending time with young genocide survivors who were young enough to be deeply impacted by the genocide. They were, most of them were orphaned by the genocide, but they were sort of young enough also to not process it the same way as their parents, and they may not even remember it in quite the same way, if at all. And they wanted to visit prisons, where in Rwanda at the time, upwards of 80% of the population is in there for the crime of genocide. So think about it. It's people who experienced genocide or are survivors of it wanting to engage with people who committed genocide. And they wanted to do this, and I went and listened to them. I did a lot of listening and learned from them, and came to know more about their needs, ultimately helped them set up this program, which was called the Prison Visiting Project. And what I realized in my time with them was there is a tremendous falsehood at the heart of our justice system, right? We assume, and I have the myths on one side and what I argue is the reality on the other. We talk a lot about punishment. And when something bad happens, as I've said, we say who did it and how do we punish them? And punishment means prison in our system, or some form thereof. But in fact, we need to reframe justice and think about how do we address the needs of the harmed, right? How do we center survivors in the crux of our system as opposed to those who've committed the harm? The next myth is this idea that those who are harmed benefit from revenge or punishment, right? When someone does wrong, when a crime occurs, it basically becomes, all right, how do we punish the person who did this? How do we harm the person who did this? By sending them to prison. Whereas what I came to learn and what I continue to learn is that those who are harmed are benefiting from repair and healing. That's a very different thing. Right? We don't have to assume that revenge and punishment is going to give people repair and healing, but yet we do. Because when a crime occurs, when harm occurs, those who are harmed are only offered revenge or punishment in the form of a prison sentence, not systems of repair, avenues of reparations. And their needs, in fact, and this I continue to learn by engaging with people who are survivors of great harm, including the young people in Rwanda. Their needs are things like narrative sharing, understanding, being assured that this will never happen again. Things that are quite different from the punitive approach that our prison system embodies. And lastly, this idea that people who have caused harm must be punished is, again, what our prison system represents. But yet we don't call our prison system a department of punishment. We call it a department, or a department of revenge for that matter. We call it a department of corrections. And so fundamentally, we're kind of talking out of both sides of our mouth, because we talk about this idea of corrections, and corrections is quite different from punishment. Right? Corrections implies that we need to engage in a form of correction, not only on the person, but perhaps the society that produced the person. I'll come back to this point in a moment because it's so important. But I really I began to rethink this whole idea of punishment and revenge at the heart of our system. And I wanted to continue thinking about that because of how important it is. It's really the building block for our thinking about justice. And I continued it in South Africa, where I went from Rwanda. So this photo is Pollsmoor Prison. It's quite a legendary prison in the world. It's the largest penal colony in Africa. It's very similar to Rikers Island in many respects. One of them is that it's predominantly consists, it's what we would call a jail. People in it are awaiting trial. More than 80% of people in it are awaiting trial, sometimes for very long periods of time. It's also quite similar to Rikers in that it is a horror show. It is full of violence and disease. The South African government owes billions of dollars in damages to the people whose lives have been damaged by their time at Pollsmoor Prison. It's severely overcrowded. When I was there, it was around 233% capacity, and there were some 40 people in a cell. I'm sure it's much higher than that now, given that, and again, we can discuss this during the Q&A, but the pandemic has really increased prison populations in many places because of the waiting for trial. It's also a disease-ridden place, some 90% transmission rate of tuberculosis. Of course, the most famous person to be incarcerated there is Nelson Mandela, who spent 6 years there. So I went there to engage in a restorative justice program, as you can see from the sign. And it's run by a formerly incarcerated man who's been working in Pollsmoor for many years. And I wanted to think about, of course, South Africa, like Rwanda, is a country that has a great national horror sitting at its core, and that is the horror and the crime of apartheid. So I'm still thinking about sort of national harms and the needs of those who are harmed by them, and the legacy of those national horrors as well. But I also wanted to think about this idea of restoration, of apology, of punishment, of harm on a kind of one-to-one scale. And so I became ultimately a volunteer facilitator in this restorative justice program, during which these men, many of whom are identified gang members who've lived extremely violent lives, who have quite the narratives. They spent 8 days building with each other, sharing, taking accountability, and then ultimately on the final day of the workshop, confronting the people who they've harmed most, namely their family members and or close friends. And it was an extremely emotional process. It's still happening currently in Pollsmoor. And I had many, many takeaways from this experience. But I think most of all, and I come back to these points a lot whenever I'm talking about prison, and I come back to South Africa quite a bit. This resonated with me particularly because South Africa, I mean, we had apartheid in this country as well, right? We just call it segregation as opposed to apartheid. And it ended about 20 years earlier than it did in South Africa. So it's even more raw and even more visceral and tangible and visible in South Africa than it is here. And what you come to see is the way that the people who are filling prison cells, as is the case in the US, are those who have been deliberately disempowered, disenfranchised, criminalized by way of poverty, segregation, given lack of opportunity, discriminated against systemically, and then by virtue of that, become involved in crime and then ultimately fuel the growth in the prison population. And so when people talk about second chances, this idea that we should give people a second chance at opportunity when they come out of prison, you come to realize that that's actually a misnomer, because these people in prison, and I think about the men in South Africa, all over the world really, but I think it's particularly undeniable there, that these are people who are direct legacies of a system of segregation, a system of harm, a system of national harm that ultimately conditions people for crime, and then also makes it far more, in many respects, normal to be involved in crime, given the communities that they continue to exist in, the way that apartheid still exists, segregation still exists in the US. And so they haven't been given first chances. And I often emphasize this in terms of the prison to college pipeline, by the way, the idea that those people in prison deserve second chance at education. They never got first chances because of systemic poverty, systemic racism, systemic inequality. So it's really important to recognize that, not to let people off the hook, but to recognize the ways that systems and structures produce this. And so when we talk about rehabilitation, which is my second point, rehabilitation implies that, number one, that people need to be rehabilitated as opposed to habilitated. But per point number one, most people in prison were not habilitated in the first place, again, because of the systems and structures that are grounded in inequality and racism. So the re is a misnomer, but also this idea, and this is what I was hinting at a few moments ago, this idea that it's the people who need to be rehabilitated or corrected. But in fact, the society that continues to be so radically unequal, so radically grounded in systemic racism, that's what needs to be worked on, in addition to the people who've caused the harm. And so we need to fix our society so it's more equal, so it's less grounded in systemic racism, in order to really talk about justice. And then lastly, and this point I can't emphasize enough, because I mean, the term offenders and victims is actually quite offensive to those of us who are progressive in this work for several reasons. One is that offenders is a label, it's a negative label, and I always try to use the language of humanity, so people in prison as opposed to convicts or offenders or ex-cons. And many survivors don't like to be called victim either, because a victim is helpless, as opposed to a survivor, which is an empowered term. But ultimately, we create these false binaries between offenders and victims. We imagine that the offenders are inside, the victims are out, but we need to recognize that, in fact, the overwhelming majority of people in prison, and this is especially true for women, as I'll talk about in a moment, are both victims and offenders, that the harm is happening in communities. And when it comes to, abuse, by family members, when it comes to abuse by society as a result, again, of systemic racism and inequity, we need to recognize that this is a cycle of harm in which the people who are causing harm have also been victimized, whether it's directly victimized in their communities or by family members, or victims of a society that is so radically inequitable. And so we need to break down these binaries and think twice about them. So moving on to Uganda, and I realize this is a whirlwind, so I promise you that I was giving you a snapshot of this, and we can talk more in the Q&A. But I went from thinking about these larger questions of justice, these larger questions of, sort of the philosophy of harm and punishment, to thinking about some of the more specifics of how we do this thing called corrections. And one of them is the arts. And it exists around the world. We see there are programs in music, theater, writing. I myself, in the prison to college pipeline, taught writing for many years in prisons and still do. So I wanted to think about, how do we do this act of correcting, and particularly the role of the arts. And so I went to Uganda first and spent time with these young men. They're in Luzira prison, which is one of the most extreme, dire circumstances one could ever imagine. It's a prison that was built for 600 people and now holds close to 6,000 men, women, and children, and people on death row. So, people are sleeping, standing up. It's obviously an extreme, dire situation. And I also went to Jamaica, another extremely dire prison that is at more than twice its capacity. Again, these numbers are probably higher now because of COVID, and we don't have all the data. But in both of these programs, there were arts programs. One in Uganda was a creative writing program that I started. One in Jamaica was a reggae music program. And I wanted to think about the role of the arts in corrections and what they do, especially in these extremely dire circumstances and contexts. I'll come back to Chile in a moment. And there were several takeaways. Just FYI, this is La Penitenciaria in Chile, in Santiago, Chile, another extremely overcrowded prison where there are some arts programs happening. And I ultimately came to a few conclusions. One is I am a writer, I am an artist, and I believe in the power of the arts. And I watched as people in these prisons were deeply impacted by writing, by reclaiming agency, by, via the pen, by healing from trauma of both before prison and during prison in the context of music programs. But I also ultimately in my book call them kind of a Band-Aid on an amputated limb, because no amount of music program or theater program or yoga program is going to, address the systems and structures, again, coming back to the systems and structures that produce these horrifying prisons in the first place. And speaking of the production of these prisons in the first place, and that's why I will go back for a second. If you look at the architecture of these prisons, you start to notice, and you'll see this throughout, that many of them look similar. And it started to be a bizarre thing to turn up in whatever part of the world and see the exact same structure everywhere. And what I came to learn, and getting into prison history in my book, is that in a nutshell, the US invented the modern prison based on European ideas that were circulating during the so-called Enlightenment in the 18th century. And then at the time, given that most of the world was under colonial domination, these colonial leaders came to the US to see our first two modern prisons, particularly Eastern State Penitentiary in Pennsylvania. And they came to see these, and then they built them and imposed them on their colonies. And so what we're ultimately talking about is what I often refer to as a cut and paste system of justice, because that's what prisons are. The idea of responding to crime by locking people up in a dungeon, and the amount of years they get equals the amount of, somehow is the equivalent of the amount of harm that they've caused, is a relatively recent invention, about 200 years old. Now, this is a very dramatic, for me, it was quite a dramatic epiphany, because we assume these things, we take for granted that they've just always been around. But in fact, there were lots of other systems of justice, some of them far more just than others, restorative approaches among the indigenous communities of the world, and some, of course, involved banishment, penal colonies, things like that, or beheadings, which we might see as not very humane. But ultimately, this idea, because it's a recent invention, the undoing of it starts to become possible. And likewise, it starts to become very real that the US has a role to play in global contexts of mass incarceration. It's our system. We invented it, and to a great extent, we foisted it on the world. Eastern State Penitentiary was a modern marvel at the time that it was opened in the 1820s in Pennsylvania. It was run on the idea of solitary confinement, which comes from the idea of a monastery, penitentiary, penitence. And again, this notion that you could put someone in a single cell and give them a Bible and they would just magically reform after 5 years of being by themselves is fairly ludicrous. And yet that was the notion of Eastern. And Eastern State was very expensive. I like to say that the US has been spending money on prisons for a couple of centuries now, or wasting money on prisons for a couple centuries now. There was running water in Eastern State Penitentiary before there was running water in the White House. That is how much we were invested in this system and showing it off to the world. So that became sort of the basis of, in many ways, the visuals of my journey. I spent time in Thailand. As you can see, this is a population of women who are incarcerated. And the women are the fastest rising prison population in the world. In the US, our women have gone up by, the population of incarcerated women has gone up by 700% in the last about decade, which is just unfathomable. And I went to Thailand to think about this particularly, and this is Ratchaburi prison in Thailand. Because this is particularly salient in Southeast Asia, in places like Thailand. And the reason why women are being locked up at such high numbers all around the world, but particularly in Southeast Asian countries, is because of the war on drugs. Women are often the greatest victims of extremely draconian drug laws. And this is because they are the small foot soldiers in the war on drugs. And they are usually affiliated with a partner, a male partner, who has a more powerful role. And they play the role of the kind of, again, obedient foot soldier. So what you find in a country like Thailand, where there's some 25,000 21,000 of the 25,000 convicted people in prison in Thailand are serving time for drug offenses, and 18,000 of them are doing at least 20 years for these offenses. And these are not major offenses. These can be, it can be considered trafficking if you just carry a few grams from one place to another. If you cross the border into Laos, which is often not very far, depending on where you are in the country, you can be sentenced to death because that's international drug trafficking. So women are being devastated. And of course, the gender roles are heavily involved too. If your boyfriend asks you or your husband to carry a package over from one house to another, then given the dynamics of gender roles, you're going to say yes. And so I went to Thailand. I ultimately spent time with the Princess of Thailand, who has an organization to help women in prison and to try to reform the conditions of women's prison and advocate on their behalf. There's still quite a lot of work being done. I later visited Taiwan, where I found the exact same thing. I mean, upwards of 80% of the prison population in for drug offenses, loosely termed drug offenses, could be use, could be addiction. And ultimately, this reinforces, I think, on a grand scale, again, the binary that we imagine to be true about prison systems. These women are not, are victims. They're victims of inequitable drug laws. They're victims of misogyny and other kinds of, gender roles that don't serve them in a society. They are sometimes victims of poverty as well, which we know leads to trauma and to drug use and self-medication with drugs. And so, I think the situation with women is particularly dire. There's a lot of data around abuse of women in the US prison context, and we know that upwards of 80% of women in prison have been victims of some form of domestic violence, whether physical or emotional. That's an overwhelming number. And so thinking about women, responding to women's harm by locking them up is particularly nonsensical, right? And particularly unjust. Moving on to Brazil. So if I showed you this picture, I can imagine that you would not, you would not be able to identify where it is or think it's in the US. It could be anywhere. It looks like a generic supermax, a supermax prison, which is a super maximum facility, highly secure facility where individuals are in solitary for 23, sometimes 24 hours a day. And this is, in fact, a US invention as well. And that's why it could be anywhere. The US created the supermax in the 1980s. And once again, our innovation was foisted on the world, sometimes deliberately, and also through our inevitable influence on the world, our cultural influence on the world as the US. And so you now see supermaxes in at least a dozen countries. This particular one in Brazil is one of 5 supermaxes that were built at an enormous price to taxpayers. They, very, very expensive, more than $120,000 a year per person to house someone in there, in a country that we certainly know does not, is not rolling in cash and has needs. Now, if this actually made Brazil safer, we might say, all right, well, it's an investment. But if you've seen the headlines in Brazil even before COVID, it hasn't. The crime rates have not been impacted by the development, by the ramping up of the prison population, period. Brazil is the fastest rising prison population in the Americas, with nearly 1 million incarcerated, hasn't made the place safer, nor has the expense of these supermaxes. And in fact, and this is true about prisons more generally, but particularly supermaxes, one of the greatest myths is that prisons make us safer, right? So even if it's, harmful, and even if we could say it's unfair and it's racially unjust, well, it's creating safer communities. Not so. There is loads of data to show us that, in fact, prisons, particularly solitary confinement, do not make us safer. They further traumatize people, sending them out into society further traumatized, with less access to opportunities and resources, more connections to various kinds of criminal networks, and ultimately, therefore, make us less safe. I often, trot out the statistic, recidivism rates, or how many people go back to prison after coming out, is often used as a measure of whether something works. This is complicated, but let's just say it is. Pretty much everywhere in the world, you have a recidivism rate of upwards of 60%. If a company were run on a 35% success rate, it would be shut down immediately. And yet prisons persist with that kind of success rate. And that is because fundamentally, we know that they're not really about making us safer. They're about ways of warehousing particular segments of society, particularly Black and brown segments, or poor people in the global South. And I'll talk some more about this in a moment. Solitary is especially the case in this regard, because when we look at solitary confinement, it produces irrevocable damage, psychological damage. I saw people literally going mad before my eyes in Brazil, who were in solitary for years, and then just being released out into society with any support. It's hard to imagine that that is going to make for safer communities. Speaking of over-incarceration, well, first of all, in this photo, you can see that this is yet another prison modeled after the Eastern model, that same cut and paste model, that dungeon model, or that medieval castle type model. This is Fremantle Prison in Western Australia, where I spent time in Perth. And there were two things that I went there for to understand more about. One is the relationship between capitalism and justice, or rather the unholy matrimony between capitalism and justice. And this is something that's true all over the world, but in Australia, particularly so, given that this is the country with the highest percentage of people incarcerated in private prisons in the world. Some 20% of the population, as it was then. And private prisons, privatization is, once again, a US invention, 1980s, that the rest of the world followed suit and ran with. And so you now see various forms of privatization all over the world. And I wanted to understand more about this. I spent time in a couple of the private prisons in Australia. And also, once again, to confront this idea of prisons as a form of social control. In the US, we talk about again, thinking about 13th and the new Jim Crow, the direct lineage from slavery to mass incarceration. Well, in Australia, it's the same process, only it's the indigenous populations who are massively over-incarcerated. This is true in New Zealand as well, where you see some 51% of the prison population is Maori, even though about 15% of the population as a whole is Maori. So massive over-incarceration of Aboriginal peoples in Australia and New Zealand, which happened by the same process as the US process, right? In early 20th century in Australia, you wanted to find a way to keep the indigenous people contained and oppressed. And so you invented the Aboriginal laws. And these were laws that made it illegal to essentially breathe. If you were Aboriginal, there were curfews. It was easy to arrest people for loitering. This still goes on. It goes on in the context of the US as well, in terms of misdemeanors, drug offenses, and other small things. All over the post-colonial world, you still have laws on the books for things like loitering or noise, which can then be used against the other, whether it's an indigenous person, an African-American person in the US, or a poor person in Uganda as a legacy of the class system of colonialism. So all of these things come together ultimately to create, the need for more prison building and more prison industry, hence these private companies. Now, it's important to point out, and there's a few myths, realities, I can expand on this single one. Private prisons are more effective and thus more just, might be something that many people imagine to be the case. But in fact, when you're creating a dangerous, unjust relationship between justice and economics, when the building of your prison requires that the beds be filled, you know what that's going to mean. It's going to mean more arrests, more incarceration, even more laws on the books. As after Australia fully privatized its immigration detention services, then a wave of xenophobic laws and legislation ran through the country in order to fill those beds. This is the natural outgrowth. The thing I will point out, and we can talk about it some more, there's lots more data on it, is that it's important to recognize that this, what I call this dangerous, unjust relationship between justice and economics is not only about the private prison system. There's lots of ways that money is mixed up in our justice system and global justice systems. So when we think about the phone companies that are used in state prisons, the tablets that are used in state prisons, the bank cards that are given to people when they come out with the $20 they may have managed to save in 30 years of working for 5 cents an hour. JP Morgan Chase makes money off of those. Phone companies make money, tablet companies, these are all money-making enterprises. And so we have intertwined economics and justice in a way that, is really nothing short of vile. And this happens globally. Ankle monitoring devices, by the way, are one of the biggest money makers in the prison industry, or in the surveillance industry as a whole. So the second to last country I went to, so I'm getting close to wrapping up, and we can chat, is Singapore. And when you think of Singapore, I'm sure most of you don't think of an enormously progressive country in terms of justice. You probably think about caning. Caning is still legal there. You can get a ticket for, and potentially fined and perhaps prisoned for chewing gum. It's illegal, or eating some fruits on the subway that smell bad. And when you land, it will say death to drug traffickers under Singaporean law, right on your boarding card, on your landing card rather. So there are some very draconian systems at play. What I went there to see, though, was something that is quite progressive, and that is the Singaporean approach to what we call reentry. Reentry is when a person's been in prison, comes home, and they reenter society. And I often say that it's another term I hate, because it makes it sound so simple, right? You went out, now you re-enter. But in fact, re-entry, or what the world calls reintegration or reinsertion, is anything but an easy, smooth process. It is an obstacle course. There are legal forms of discrimination available to make your life essentially a living hell. So you can be discriminated against by jobs, by housing. Legally, you have to check boxes, everything you do, on the school you apply for. And not only that, neighbors perhaps look at you a certain way. In many ways, re-entry, like rehabilitation, is a misnomer as well, because re-entry to a society that you never really had access to, again, giving legacies of racism, giving legacies of inequality. And so Singapore, though, has an interesting approach. And this, actually, I should go back to the ad I just showed. This is an ad by the Singaporean government it's part of its project to sensitize the community to people coming home from prison, and also to encourage the hiring of them. And so Singapore, which has one of the lowest recidivism rates in the world, has an incredible success rate in finding jobs for people while they're still in prison, supporting them when they come out, in staying in those jobs, and then promoting a culture of reintegration, of acceptance, so that employers, housing operators, all of these people do not discriminate against it. It's kind of a no-brainer, but it works enormously well. And it's a model that I come back to a lot as being really, really effective. And I think as in the US, as people come to see this issue more, it's certainly more helpful. So it's important to recognize that reentry is this obstacle course that again makes us less safe, because people who come home and can't get jobs, can't get stable housing, are not given trauma-assisted care, are not going to reintegrate and are likely to fall back into crime, into instability. And so it's in our benefit, again, to work on this. The last country, and I'll close here, I know I've done a lot of talking and taken you a lot of places, but ultimately, Norway is where I ended my journey. And believe it or not, this is a prison. It is a quite famous prison by now. It was in Michael Moore's documentary, Sicko, and has been featured in other places. It's called Bastøy. It is an open prison. And what that means is the people in it who are incarcerated there can leave and work jobs on the outside, go to school on the outside, remain connected to the social services of the outside. It's not a warehouse. It does deprive people of liberty, full liberty, but they get family leave, and they ultimately, when they come out, are able to reintegrate in a far better way. The open prison model operates throughout Scandinavia. Not all prisons are open. In Norway, it's about 30%. They're small. They are sort of holistically driven and ecologically driven often, as Bastøy is. It's an island. And it's considered, enormously successful. Their recidivism rates are much lower if we use that as a standard. And people who come out of them generally don't go back to prison. Very different from all of these, Eastern medieval-like entities. And there are open prisons elsewhere in the world. This one is in Italy I visited. Again, it's an anomaly, not unlike the other Italian prisons, but it's a wine farm and people can have work leave, they get paid, they can have family leave, and it's working quite well in many respects and via various standards of measurement. The thing about Norway, and I learned a lot from Norway. I continue to learn a lot from Norway, as I do from all of the countries that I think have some innovative things about them and things to teach us as Americans. But ultimately, Norway gets things right for not only because of the open prison model, it kind of gets things right on all ends of the spectrum. And I'll come to this slide in a moment, but there's the before, the during, and after when we think about prisons. The before being, how do we create avenues for opportunities so that people don't, and access to jobs and education so that people don't go to prison in the first place. And Norway does this through social services. It has an enormously powerful social service sector supporting people. People are supported as a whole. During, if you do incarcerate people, put them in open prisons that allow them to remain connected to community and family and life and work, all of the things that keep people healthy and productive. And then after, of course, is the reentry, reintegration piece. And once again, the open prison model does quite a bit with that. The other thing is that Norway's staff, the corrections officers in Norway, are trained professionals. They go to a special academy, which I had the pleasure of visiting. They study philosophy, social work, law, literature, things that allow them to truly engage in the act of creations. And staff is such an important thing as well. And, at the end of the day, and these are my kind of grand conclusions and takeaways, or some of them from the whole journey. As I've been saying throughout, this idea that prisons make us safer, and the idea that prisons are synonymous with justice or the only way to do justice is a tremendous myth. And I really, and this only intensifies for me as I continue to do the global work and engage with global audiences. I think we are going to look back on prisons like the way we look back on the guillotine, the chopping the heads off. And we say, God, I can't believe they put that right in the public square and did that and invited people to come see it. That's what we're going to say about prisons. They are archaic, they're outdated, they're torturous. And we're ultimately, and I do believe this, especially in the context of the pandemic, we can talk some more about that. We are moving toward a world without prisons, a world in which we truly can create justice through communities, through building communities, and all kinds of other restorative avenues, and so on. I will stop here. I'll just show you quickly. After my book came out, but you saw this logo on the slide and in my bio, but I encourage you to check it out. IncarcerationNationsNetwork.com is what I work on now. We are a global network of change makers that kind of came about in the context of my journeys and writing the book, and then having the book come out in several languages. It comes out in Italian next month. And is a way to share practices and build together, and most importantly, take on this issue across national borders, think of it as a global issue, approach its problems and its solutions in a global context. So thank you for spending this time with me. I look forward to some interesting questions.
Thank you, Dr. Dresinger. Our first question here today is, given your emphasis on restorative justice and your understanding that society needs rehabilitation, would you consider yourself a prison abolitionist?
Oh, yes. Good question. I should have made that very clear. I definitely am an abolitionist. And by that, I mean, I work towards a world in which prisons are not necessary and prisons don't have to exist. I don't think that that will happen tomorrow, or even in my lifetime necessarily, but all of the work that I do is guided by that as my North Star. And I do think it's possible. And I think that we have to do a lot of things at once, because there is also a place for, I mean, I talked about Band-Aids in the context of Uganda and Rwanda. There is a place for Band-Aids, right? You don't want to bleed all over the place. So we have to continue kind of chipping away at the block. There's a place for reform work and small changes and incremental changes, but our big picture goal is abolition, and we should always keep our eyes on that prize.
Next question, are your top line statements uniformly applicable? Is Bernie Madoff a victim who deserves a first chance in life? It seems the natural limits to your arguments are about institutional racism or economic inequity, not about all incarcerated people. I'm not disagreeing with the approach, just with the breadth of the generalizations in the argument.
Yes, I'm glad that that caveat was brought up. By no means does this apply to everyone in prison. Madoff would be a perfect example. But it does refer, in my experience and as the data shows, to the overwhelming majority. And so therefore, in our conversations about this, it's far more useful to talk about the norm rather than the exception. And these kinds of, crimes of privilege are far fewer and far between, I think, than the norm, which is these crimes that are born of systemic racism, systemic inequality. I think I often also get asked quite a bit, what about the murderers and the rapists and so on and so forth. There is, it's a complicated answer to that question, but number one is that we need to recognize that the overwhelming majority of people in prison in the world are not in for crimes of rape and murder. So again, not to say we don't have to address those very damaging acts of harm, but it's far more useful to think about, the rule rather than the exception. Yeah, so I'll pause there.
Okay, this is going to be a little bit lengthy, but the viewer says, I believe early in your presentation, you made a point to paraphrase, I hope accurately, that the US imposes its view of prison on the world. It's very chilling to learn. So thank you first for that perspective. But this person says, I'm currently reading Claudio Sant's Unworthy Republic, the disposition of Native Americans on the road to Indian territory. And what you say about prison system is eerily echoed by Sant's statement that the US would later provide a model from this behavior toward Native Americans for the planning of exterminations in Europe by Hitler's planners for the final solution. Is there a country or a movement or even a thinker on the subject, in addition to yourself, which you see providing a new model for restorative justice to the rest of the world?
Wow, that's really, really powerful. Thank you for sharing that. It actually makes me think of, I recently saw, and I can't recommend enough, the documentary Exterminate All the Brutes, Raoul Peck's new documentary. It's 4 parts, and it's enormously powerful. I don't know the text that was mentioned. It sounds really rich, but that particular documentary I recommend to everyone in this context, thinking about America's role in all of this. And I should also say that the imposition of this happens, for ease, I'm saying imposition. Sometimes it's happening through sort of cultural dominance and it's not official. And then in other contexts, particularly in Latin America, and in the context of countries where terrorism is a threat, it is actually an imposition through various US embassies and US consulates who are pushing for incarceration as a way to keep these issues in check. So that there's less migration and less terrorism, which bounces back and harms the US. So we are actively, as a country, involved in prison systems in countries around the world, like Mexico, El Salvador, et cetera, because what happens in the prisons and in the communities there affects us. And so we have a stake in there. As far as restorative justice goes, so there are lots of, in the Incarceration Nations network, which is the network that I founded, we have a number of restorative justice partners who are doing really powerful work in this space. One of them is in New York, it's called Common Justice. Another is called Impact Justice. These are two organizations. One, Impact Justice is based in Oakland, California, but has national presence. Common Justice, as I said, is in New York. I also visited the national programs of restorative justice. In Costa Rica, there's a national restorative justice program. Peru has a national restorative justice program. Washington, D.C.'s District Attorney's Office has a restorative justice program. We're seeing a lot of these crop up. And so I would also recommend Danielle Sered's book, Until We Reckon. Sered, S-E-R-E-D, has written, she is the founder of Common Justice, and her book came out about a year ago. It's extraordinary. So there's, I look at the practitioners, look at this stuff in practice, and you can learn more about it. And I'll also add that INN, Incarceration Nations Network, we have just completed a docuseries that's sort of, I don't want to say it's based on my book, but inspired by my book that I directed, that showcases the work of our partners and also showcases what I've been talking about, the ways in which this issue cuts across national borders and boundaries. And we'll be world premiering it at the Tribeca Film Festival in June, which is very exciting. And then touring with it to campuses. We're putting it on a big screen truck that will visit different campuses and parks and spaces all over the country. If folks are interested, we'd be happy to come to Carleton or any other location in the area. One of the episodes is about restorative justice. It's called Heal Not Harm. And I guess I'm a little biased because I am a fanatic for the practice, but it's kind of my favorite episode. And it really, I think, breaks down the force of this kind of justice.
Do you think that social work and community help will ultimately work in the US, since we seem to be a very individualistic society, as we have seen with COVID? Will it be beneficial here like it has been in Norway?
Great question. And I thought about this a lot during, as we're dealing with COVID and trying to suddenly sell an American public so raised on individualism, radical individualism, to wear a mask because of your grandmother or your neighbor, right? We haven't been, very successful at persuading folks of that. I do think we have a lot of work to do in shifting the narrative of our nation. I hope it's achievable, but I do think we have to shift the narrative to think about the commons, to think about the common good, and get Americans to understand what that means, get the US to understand. I mean, look, this is the mess of COVID. What's happening in India right now is not just about feeling for India. It's because we are in the same boat as India. We're all in the world together. In terms of, and I'm referring to the horrific tragedies of death that are occurring right now in India via the pandemic. So I do think there's a lot of narrative shifting that has to happen there. But the other reality is that we need to come better on our social services. So we need to have access in communities to social services. I often say, as I said about Norway is radical because of two words, social services, which to Americans is like, socialism and terrifying. We need to work on that and shifting people's understanding of that. And then actually shifting towards the social services that's grounded in community. I mean, we've heard a lot of talk in the defund the police movement. And I extend that to the defund the prisons movement about, just put it all on social workers. Well, it's not that simple. Social workers have also been involved in, imposing values on communities that they're not a part of, in impacting families in a negative way through foster care and so on. We need to make sure that as we have social services, that they're truly from the ground up, and not top down, imposed on communities, but rather coming from the communities themselves.
First, may I ask if you have information about forms of corruption in our penitentiary system?
I can't think of there's loads of examples. There have been so many of them over the years. I think the culture of it cries out for corruption, particularly because, as I was saying, the prison staff are, we don't pay our staff, the prison staff. Well, same is true of other important jobs in our society, like the police force. I can't think of an aggregate source that lists it bit by bit, but all you have to do is open the news and you're seeing cases of, how do you think drugs get into prisons or other illegal substances? We create conditions for that kind of corruption when we don't actually, train our officers in any kind of real way, a la the Norwegian approach, pay them well, treat them well. I mean, we got to recognize that a toxic environment is toxic for everyone there. And that means those who are incarcerated there and those who work there. No one should be subjected to Rikers Island, for instance, not just those incarcerated there, but the officers who are, facing those conditions and that level of violence and threat and trauma-inducing conditions every day. And so, if we want to address corruption, we gotta explode the whole thing and start over.
Are there states in the U.S. that are doing a better than average job with their prison systems?
Yes, and it's a very state by state thing, frankly. Prison populations, of course, vary, but they're also, every state kind of does its own thing to a great extent with lots of overlap. California right now is, went through, for one, it added an R to its name. It used to be California Department of Corrections, and it became California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation. Despite the fact of my not liking that term, it was an acknowledgement of we're trying to do something different. But California ultimately was under constitutional mandate to reduce its prison population, and so has been heavily working to do so. And recently, what I was excited to learn is that as part of its defund the police efforts, it redistributed $50 million, I believe it was $50 million, don't quote me on the exact number, of its funding towards violence prevention community organizations, which is a wonderful thing to do. So that's just one example. But to know, you have to look state by state in terms of understanding, who's doing okay. In my own state, New York, we did well in the pandemic of reducing our our jail population. Rikers Island was at its lowest rate, but it's kind of skyrocketed back up. And we've seen a lot of that. During the pandemic, there were lots of releases done, but folks, as the pandemic allegedly fades, things are ramping back up. Folks are awaiting trial. There's a backlog of cases around the country, around the world, really. But a backlog of cases that is really quite traumatic. And so it means people are awaiting trial for even longer periods of time than they were.
This has been quite enlightening, and I'm convinced that the conversation can and should continue, and I'm hoping that our viewers will continue those conversations. But in closing, how can we come to an altogether different paradigm for thinking about crime, thinking about safety, thinking about accountability, and what justice really looks like?
Yeah, that's the $1 million question. I don't have the simple answer for it. And I get asked a lot, what can I do? What can I do? Well, for one, learn. I mean, today has been important. Events like these are critical. I have been deeply heartened by what's happened in the last year in particular around conversations on prisons and policing and justice and, and anti-racist work and and settler colonialism, and all of these things that we need to know. And knowledge goes a long way. Education is critical. Conversations are important. So continue to learn and read and watch. There's so much great material out there, perhaps more than ever before, and more accessible than ever before. Spread that word to others by not being afraid to call people out politely, but call them out. And lastly, I think, there are formerly incarcerated people who are facing even harder reintegration now than ever before in a pandemic where there's economic woes. Find out who those organizations are in your, home area. And if you know someone who has a business, if you know someone who's hiring, refer them. I mean, that's as direct action as it can get.
Well, thank you again, Dr. Dreisinger, and thank you all for joining us today. Our guest next week will be Sia Her, Executive Director of the Minnesota State Council on Asian Pacific Minnesotans. Until then, Be well and be kind. Thank you.